AutoMapper and MediatR with Jimmy Bogard.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your humble host. Make sure to check out www.azuredevops.show for past episodes and show notes. And I'm thrilled that lots of people are taking me up on my open invitation to speak virtually at your .NET user group. It's been a lot of fun. And if you run a .NET user group, I'd love to get on your schedule. I know meeting in person is a little bit difficult these days, so a lot of user groups around the country are doing video meetings and keeping the community going. So also, if you're tuning in for the first time, the Azure DevOps Podcast is for developers who are shipping software with Microsoft technologies. And my goal for all development teams is that they're able to move fast, deliver quality, and run their systems with confidence. And if you have some specific issues you'd like some help with, well, that's what we do as an architecture company. So my guest today on the show is Jimmy Bogard. He is an independent consultant, a longtime Microsoft MVP award recipient, C# guru. He's the author and maintainer of AutoMapper and some other open source projects and many, many, many other things. Jimmy, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
Good. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Well, man, I can't believe I haven't had you on the show already. I think we're going on 2 years of this podcast coming out every week.
Oh, that's awesome.
But, you know, I think a lot of people who are familiar with you and have either seen you speak at conferences or seen the recordings of those conferences out there. But for those who might be getting introduced for the first time, can you just tell your story? You have your own consulting company now, but you've done quite a lot of things. Give us the rundown. Where did it start?
Oh, if we're going to go all the way back.
Where were you born?
Let's not go all the way back. Right. So I've been doing consulting for 13 years-ish now or so. Of course, you recruited me. I think I told that story a couple of times of me, the clueless me, not knowing that you were trying to recruit me while you were recruiting me. But that was my first consulting gig. And before then, I was at a big corp IT. Didn't really like that environment. I was at a product company before that and a startup before that. So having done like the startup, the product, the IT, none of those I was really happy with, and finally landed consulting, and I've loved it and been doing it ever since.
Now that's interesting. I've spoken to a lot of people who are in consulting, just professional services as the big umbrella, and I hear people saying, "Oh man, I want to go work for a product company. That would be awesome." But you kind of are on the flip. Tell me, what's your thought process about that?
Oh gosh. So it was a lot of fun for like two and a half years. But once you kind of build it and it's out there, there's not a lot else to do. Now you're just kind of incrementally adding little pieces here and there. And because I didn't have any stake in the company, or I didn't own the product, I couldn't really influence about the direction it was going. So I was just kind of like just waiting for the sales folks to tell me, okay, this is the next feature we want to do it, and then wait another few months and then do something else. And so I just saw that I wasn't getting a lot of different experience at the time. And so I wanted more variety. Let's try something else, get something else in my resume, do something different. So I might do something if it was I have more direction and ownership. But since I had none of that, then it was like, I'm at the whim of someone else of deciding what I get to work on. Mm-hmm. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah. I've heard some consultants say that just the world of consulting is kind of like a experience in dog years. Whereas if you're at an IT company or a product company, you may work on one application or one piece of software for a year or multiple years. But when you are serving clients, you may do 4 different projects per year. And right. just be exposed to so many more things.
One thing I do miss is seeing it grow over a long period of time. Mm-hmm. So you see a decision you made day one, and you're still living with it, 2 years later. So
Right.
it really kind of says like, you got to be really deliberate and careful with your decisions. Otherwise you'll be living with this mistake because they ship, people are using it. So you can't easily change that anymore.
Yeah. Right. All right. Well, if for the people who have followed you, they're probably yelling into their, I was going to say Walkman. They're yelling into their, it's not even iPod. They're yelling into their smartphone. Ask him about AutoMapper.
Right.
So Jimmy, how did AutoMapper get started? What's the story on that?
It's like all of the open source that I do. It came out of a need on a project we were on. And I remember it was a coworker of ours, Kevin. It's like, he sat me down. It's like, Jimmy, we're about to have a big problem here. And we need someone to, we need to figure this out. Otherwise, it's going to be just so much code we're going to have to maintain. And it was a problem of, we knew, at the time, there was no direction at all for MVC. It's like, we were the trailblazers on that completely. And so there really wasn't a lot of people we could look for to say, how are you supposed to build applications with this stuff?
And what year was it?
2007, I think.
So that would have been some of the community tech previews of MVC before MVC 1 RTN, wouldn't it?
Yeah, like preview 3, I think, is the one we started on. Like when they added validation, that's when you could say like, okay, you can actually use it if it can validate things. But there was no real direction about how to use this thing. We could look at how does Rails do things, but that's so prescriptive in how it does everything. It has a full stack available for you. It's got, the active record objects and everything kind of glues together. When we get to MVC, it's just like, here's some Lego pieces, do what you want. And so we decided really early on, we didn't want to use our domain objects as the thing that passes to the view. We saw that was going to be a problem. So we said, we're going to make these other things, these DTOs, these data transfer objects. But we were looking down the pipe of a project that was going to be, 100 screens. It wound up being like hundreds of screens. Mm-hmm. And like, there's no way we want to maintain all this stupid code of mapping from one thing to the other. Especially when we started to notice that every single DTO we created was different for no good reason. And we found out like the developers were spending time and brain cycles designing each individual view model. Like, well, that property is too long. Let's make it shorter. I don't like that name. Let's make this other name. So a lot of things are just different for no good reason. And so part of the thing we were trying to do is go as fast as possible and build as quickly as possible. And that was one of the things we saw that developers are spending time on, but it's not really adding any value to the overall project. It's actually, it's subtracting value because they're spending time on it and it's code we have to test and maintain. So that was the real motivation, is kind of remove the decisions of those dumb things from the developers so they can focus on the more interesting, difficult problems. And let's make it convention based so that you just, you tell the system, this is what the thing should look like. And it should figure out how to get from the source thing to the destination thing just based on some simple rules.
So there's somebody out there who hasn't used AutoMapper and they're thinking, well, we didn't want to use our domain objects in the view. And so we did, but why? They're probably saying, why not just use it in the view?
Okay. Well, I think you find out pretty quickly if you use fancier ORMs that do the lazy loading and things like that, that if you pass those things to the view and you do like a for loop to loop over and spit out a table, then it's probably going back and hitting the database lots of times to go get its information. So it's very, very easy for you to build screens that perform horribly just because you've leaned on this feature quote of the ORM that'll just fetch things and query things behind the scenes without even knowing it. So yeah, where things were great on your local desktop, you ship to production and suddenly your application is ridiculously slow because it's making hundreds of queries on the screen. And we've seen this on our legacy systems. People complaining their application's slow. And we go and look like, well, they're just things are just getting queried left and right. And then it's not even obvious to the developers. So we made a big decision to say, the thing that goes to the view is just data, not connected to anything, and nothing else. It's to make it very, very explicit. This is a one-way arrow from the controller to the view, and it doesn't go back and try to get other junk.
Well, it would seem like even for simple cases, even if they're not even using an ORM, but domain models are really rich and granular. For instance, if you've broken out your address into an address object and your state into a state object with the display name and a code. Well, now in the view, you're saying customer.address.state.code. And the second you're doing a ... boom, now you got no reference exceptions.
Right. Yeah, that was the other big thing. So back then we didn't have the, what do they call that thing? The
question mark, yeah.
Yeah, question dot operator. Which funny enough, you can't even use that in any framework either. Like it doesn't let you use that, the little question dot thing. It'll just throw an exception saying, I don't know how to translate that thing to SQL, so we can't use it.
Mm-hmm.
So we saw that too, just like our DTOs are getting complicated, like all these deep nested object graphs. So we just said, let's just make the DTO as dumb as possible, simple as possible, and then have this tool to enforce a convention to say it has to look like the other thing to make it just, automatically mapped.
Yeah.
And if we'd stopped right there, I think no one would ever be mad at me about people abusing it.
All right. Well, why didn't it stop?
Oh, part of it was just naivete on my part. That's like, why not add features? And then, years later, realizing, oh gosh, one, shouldn't add features that I'm not going to use in the first place. That was kind of an obvious thing in retrospect, but if I get wasn't even pull request at the time, it was Codeplex. No, actually Google code. So, someone would send me patch or whatever it was.
Right, a patch code.
Patch file, right. And then, I'd be so excited that someone contributed. Well, then of course I'll take it. That'll be nice.
Right.
Not realizing I have to document it. I have to know what, if it breaks for somebody, the other person that gave me the patch is long gone.
Right.
Now it's on me. I have to fix it. So a lot of lessons learned just on trying to keep things really tightly focused and constrained. And that was a lot of the design thoughts behind MediatR, which was really trying to strip away any extra features at all from the beginning, and then only adding them when I can look at 3 or 4 projects that I was on and say, okay, this same problem was cropped up enough times that it now deserves to kind of graduate into the actual project itself.
Yeah. At some point, you came back and you added a top level interface, whereas before it was AutoMapper . And I think there's a lot of people. It's a common thing. It's like, hey, I don't want to create an object. Let me just call it something . Boom, it works. But that was a decent refactoring. What was the thought process there?
Yeah, the original interface was all static, and someone told me not to do that. I can't remember who.
Was that a leading question?
Yeah, I don't know. It's just so funny thing of you were when you first looked at it, I was excited to show it to you, and you told me it looks great. I think if I could change one thing, I would make it instant space, not static. And I was like, whatever. This is easy, just call the thing. And then not realizing much later that all the projects I was looking at as inspiration also regretted that static interface. And if I just asked them, what do you, I'm getting some feedback tonight, I can make it. What, if y'all had any problems with it? So you look at something like JSON.NET or Structure Map at the time. Those were static.
Mm-hmm.
I think JSON.NET is still static. But yeah, it just introduces all these other issues you don't really necessarily think about when you first start. And at some point, once ASP.NET Core really took over from classic ASP.NET MVC or whatever you want to call it, the previous thing, and that thing was DI built in, then it was just too hard to support the static thing and DI, which was where everything was going to be doing, where everything was going to be going. You want services dot add the thing, and if you don't have that thing, then it doesn't exist, right? In ASP.NET Core, you can't say services dot, it doesn't exist.
Right.
So I needed to have that, and then supporting the 2 interfaces was just going to be just too much of a pain. So it was a huge. I could do a whole podcast on that refactoring, but it was 2 false starts of me trying to do that and failing, and then finally getting it after a long Christmas break.
So with AutoMapper being 13 something years old now, What's your opinion on what it's the best at? What situations do you just automatically reach for it because that's its absolute sweet spot? And what scenarios do you advise? No, don't put it there. That's not the appropriate place.
I still surprise some of my, people I work with, that are surprised I don't use all my projects and every single client I have. Because every new situation, you kind of re-ask those same questions about, okay, these tools solve these specific problems. Are those problems there for me now? And if they're not there for you, then you shouldn't necessarily pick the tool that was meant to solve those problems if those problems don't exist. And the problem with we were trying to solve was a server-side MVC application in which the view models they were building were always going to be subsets and flattened versions of our domain models. And that's what every single screen was. And when we started to go past that a little bit, you start to add little extensions here and there, but sometimes the screens are so different that the mapping doesn't make any sense. So the sweet spot, if you look at Mapper itself, the sweet spot is when it's 99% default configuration, and really only 1 to 5% that's different for whatever reason. Then you do some custom config. But if you start going past that, then it's not auto anything. It's just configuration in a very weird location, way far away from your code. So we don't necessarily want that. And there's other mistake I see people make it. When we made it, I know I've made it as well. Is in cases where we look at a DTO and it looks like the domain model, but that doesn't necessarily mean we want to enforce that coupling of the convention, that this thing is always going to look like this. A good example is API contracts or messaging contracts that I'm exposing to other people. If I change my domain model, I don't necessarily want to break all the downstream consumers of my API or of my messages. So while they may look exactly the same today, I want to be able to change my domain model without having to worry about, okay, now I got to go add some custom config or whatever. So for those cases, we keep them separate. The timing we keep them the same really is when those DTOs are used inside the same application. And if they're used by other systems or other applications, or even UI spas, we won't necessarily want to keep those exactly the same all the time.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software engineering firm and Microsoft Gold partner, empowering development teams to be their best. ClearMeasure equips developers with the DevOps tools, methods, and automation necessary to focus on building their applications, rather than wrestling with builds, deployments, or environments. Click clear-measure.com to see whether a DevOps implementation is for you.
So, AutoMapper is used by just tons of teams everywhere. I lost track of how many downloads on NuGet last time I looked, but it's a lot. Another project that I see just being used and talked about a lot, and definitely I've used it on a number of projects, is MediatR. What's the backstory on that one?
Well, that was a similar kind of story where we were, in that case, I was basically copying the same code from project to project. And after the fourth or fifth project, my manager at the time told me, why don't you make an open source project out of that? And at the time I was in the middle of AutoMapper refactoring. I was I don't want more open source work. But the reality is, it's much easier to kind of carry those kind of common building blocks forward if it's just in a NuGet package. So that was really the genesis, was just this really stupid pattern, which was 100 lines of code. It's like nothing, but it copied enough times that you don't want to have that conversation again about we're going to introduce this new, more boilerplate code. We're copying and pasting. That's just kind of weird. Here's this package that's this kind of very proven pattern. It was certainly not invented by me. I don't know how old that's, decades old. Who knows? It's just a very common pattern, and heavily inspired by a lot of other work that other folks were doing. So let's just make a package and use it, and you can kind of tell about when it was built, because SignalR was new then, and so I was MediatR.
That's right, Signal-R. Well, and I wonder if Flickr, I wonder if that started the trend. Who knows?
Naming is hard.
Yeah. So MediatR, I think it started out with just, hey, I'm going to send a request and we're going to route it to a handler. And then I think it added on publishing of events at some point.
Yeah, it was originally just like a synchronous request response, send a request, get a response. But then we had times where we're doing like domain event kind of things where I didn't know who was going to get who was receiving it. And so I didn't want to couple myself to like who's, a specific response. So I wanted to publish out instead, but it was just all completely in process, in memory, immediately dispatched and handled. Similar to how like event aggregators work in like WPF apps. And so that's what I was on a project that was a WPF app. I'm like, oh, I could just also do that pattern because we were sending commands from the UI and then also publishing events that were going to be consumed by other widgets and components and stuff. So kind of all just went together. I don't use that one quite as much because I don't do a lot. Thankfully, I don't do a lot of desktop apps. It's much harder work.
Now, there's probably somebody listening who maybe looked at it and said, oh, why do I do that? I mean, inversion of control is built right in. I have repository interfaces and I have some type of interfaces that do work and I just inject those interfaces into my controller and boom, it's there and I'm off to the races and I've got one for each repository and one for each service or whatever you call it. Why do I need MediatR? What does it even buy me?
Well, for smaller systems and projects, it doesn't buy you much. And so I typically don't even introduce this kind of cross-cutting pattern that you use everywhere, and unless I know the project's going to be, at least a couple dozen actions or screens or endpoints, things like that. But where it helped us was we have these types and classes that go across multiple requests, these controller classes. And you look at each of these methods in there, and they don't really have anything to do with each other. And so if you want to extract if you want to encapsulate the code of one of those controller methods, you put it in some service class. And we started to look at these service classes and like, well, there's a service class for this thing, this method. There's a service class for this method. And they all kind of look the same. I pass some information in and I get some information out. So this was really just an exercise in trying to create a uniform interface for those service classes. And you're saying instead of having these like user order transfer service, order approval service, where they were all just like a single service class for a single method and a single controller action. I was like, well, let's just create stop thinking about these service classes and say these are just handlers for this request that comes in. And then I get a response. And I've done a lot of messaging work, and those interfaces are all about these like message oriented classes where I pass in one object that is the message, and I do some work, and I return some other object on the way out. So this was really just trying to codify that very common pattern to something that I didn't have to like think about every single time. It's just one thing goes in, one thing goes out. And what that did for us, though, is give us a lot of rails along that pattern. So if we want to do extra things around this concept of handling requests and responses, now we have a place to do that. And it's very similar to you're building on top of ASP.NET Core. If you want to add a lot of cross-cutting concerns, there's very explicit interfaces for you to do so. And so we wanted to do the similar thing for kind of domain logic behind the scenes, having like one interface of things that go in so that I have cross-cutting concerns and common seams to put things in. It's just one place to do so. Now, when we first put it in, MediatR itself, we left it up to the developers to decide, like, if the controller action is complicated, then pull down a handler. But what we found was that no one had the same objective criteria for what complicated is, or even subjective. It's just like whatever the developer thinks is complicated at the time, that day, the time of day, how many cups of coffee they had, and looked at it and said that's complicated or not. So at some point we said, okay, if you're going to use this pattern, just use it everywhere, no matter how simple or complex it is. And then you pays dividends when you see like, well, every test now looks the same. All the setup looks the same. Everything looks exactly the same. Now in the future, I hope the project actually goes away, because it would be really cool if like, I do a lot of messaging stuff. So if you ever use like in Service Bus or Mass Transit, I don't use Mediator there, right? My class is the handler, and that's, it's already encapsulated right there for me. So it'd be awesome if someone like just figured out how to do that for like ASP.NET, web applications. But until then, this works great for me to have this very simple DTO in, DTO out. Everything's encapsulated in that one class.
I haven't heard as much community banter lately as maybe 5 or even 10 years ago on CQRS, command query response segregation. But it seems like this library makes it really easy to codify everything that your application does as a command or a query or an event, right?
Yeah, and in fact, the very first interface of Mediator was commands and queries, but that made things really hard to put in cross-cutting concerns, like if I wanted to put authorization in or something like that. So then it came back to just, it's all request responses. Mm-hmm. But any system we want to do CQRS in, where we're separating handlers, one handler for commands, one handler for queries, that just gives you like CQRS out of the box.
Yeah. You mentioned explaining to developers how to think about what's complex. One thing that I found is a decent way to think about it is that the UI, this is the way I've explained it, and I think that people get it because it's simple. The user interface is responsible for understanding what the person is asking the computer to do, and then codifying the intent or the request of the human into a class with just enough information so that it can be passed along. Not doing any of the work, but saying, oh, I know what this human is asking for. I know what they want to do, what their intent is. Okay, let me create a class that has enough information. Let me create the object. And now Mediator, or the guts of the application, whatever the pipeline, however it's implemented, it's like, application, go do this, and throw it at the application. Then the application, and if you're using Mediator, that's responsible for routing that intent of the human into the bowels of the application for however that intent needs to be done. Yeah,
you've now separated out any kind of UI, because it gets messy in the UI. I like that too, because it's in the name, right? Controller. It's not doer. It's controlling other things. It's not doing the things itself.
Well, and I know that every single listener on here has read all 3 editions of our MVC in Action book, obviously. No, it's an ancient book. But I remember in that book, we talked about the controller in MVC as a traffic cop, that the view formatted visually things and also did a little bit of input, but hardly any. And the controller was just the traffic cop. It's like, hey, what is this person wanting to do? Okay, go there. If the form is not valid, well, I can't go there. Okay, reroute here. And that's it.
Yeah.
So one other, just a personal anecdote, a side effect of, and I don't know, the Mediator, it's just an implementation of a pattern, but the side effect of using that library has been in telemetry. What I found is when codifying everything the application does as one of those, I request implementations where you have an object that essentially wraps up what some transaction or some unit is going to do. We put in the pipeline. I know there's some preprocessors, but just subclassing iMediator or wrapping it a little bit. And then we put in the telemetry client of application insights. And every time a request came through, we just used the type name and a little bit of common way to get information out of it, and did a trace event to application insights. And it's like 3 lines of code that we put in there, and then running the application, we go to application insights, and immediately every single thing the application does is automatically instrumented. And we can do line graphs of, oh, how many times did users hit that button? oh, what part of the country uses that button the most? I mean, it's just automatic because there's one pipeline that literally every transaction in the application goes through that you can tap into.
Yeah, it's awesome. We've done that with like auditing, of course, the logging and telemetry. Once you have that seam and you forced everyone to use that same seam,
yeah,
then it's like all these possibilities you didn't really think about ahead of time, but it just kind of opens the door because you've kind of given yourself these rails to go down. Now you can really expand out in one direction as opposed to just kind of having any direction you could possibly go in.
Yeah,
that's really cool.
Well, we might be, and time will tell, if we are at the transition of one era to another with Blazor. What are your thoughts on Blazor? What have you done so far? There's so many people who are kind of checking it out, and they're all looking for for other stories. Okay, who's had success with what, and because no one wants to be at the bleeding edge and actually bleed. But hey, right. when there's success stories, we want to hear them. Yeah.
So unfortunately, I don't have any success stories yet myself. I'm still in the trying things out, seeing where it wants to go. But I'm one of the reasons it really excites me is because the JavaScript ecosystem is still like a smaller dumpster fire than it was before. But it's still it's still, once you get off the path a little bit, it is a rough experience.
Doesn't bring joy, does it?
No, it's not at all. And you can see this if you use something like Angular, it does provide all these common building blocks. But if you go outside of their building blocks, you're way off into the weeds, and you're in trouble. Same thing with React, where you can do the whole create React app, but as soon as you go off the path of the packages they want, then you have to expand out your Webpack thing. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, there's 500 dependencies in here. I don't know what. Because there's no one controlling the ecosystem. Like a Spring, for example. If you've done any Java project, like Spring is like, they get everything mapped out for you, from the get-go. From everything you want to do is like, there's a there's a Spring tool for that. And the same thing in the .NET side. Like you've got all these things, except the front end. So that's what really excited me about that is, I got tons of systems that don't need this separate application, which is a SPA, right? It's a totally build pipeline, deployment, CI/CD, it's two apps. I don't want two apps. I want one app. Mm-hmm. When my application isn't that complicated. You can always, I guess, reach for like control toolkits, things like that. But if you just kind of want to just enhance a little bit your experience and don't want to go full React, full SPA, that sort of thing, Blazor I could see being a really great fit there. So I'm not having to have two dev teams with two totally different backgrounds and opinions, things like that's. Like I could just have one set of folks, and they do have to learn HTML and CSS and stuff, but otherwise they don't have to have like this completely different stack in their head about how to develop. So it can actually live up to the whole full stack dev again. We'll see.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of people looking at it and asking, oh, what is this thing? This is really different from the whole last, I guess, 13, 14 years of Microsoft-centric web development, because Microsoft has integrated so much of Angular, React, Vue, and with TypeScript and Angular, and but at the same time, Microsoft seems to be really serious about this with the Maui project that they're talking about, and with .NET 6, which is kind of the Blazor development model at its core. So it really seems like they're serious about this, and this isn't just oh yeah, you could also use this, but it seems like they're saying, no, this is a critical path here.
Yeah, I had people ask me, it's like, this looks just like Silverlight. Like, well, not really, because that was a COM something, right? Running in
it's a plugin, yeah.
A browser plugin. Where it is built on a standard. It's the WebAssembly standard. So it's and it's open source. It's open source, built on top of a standard. Yes, it's Microsoft, but it's what a lot of other folks are trying to do. So they're not the only folks trying to do this. Of it's there are definitely some user experiences. You want the full spa experience, but if you don't want that full spa experience, you're just like somewhere over here. There's really nothing, nothing there. Like, I got started in like Ajax days a long time ago doing client-side stuff when the X was still XML.
Yeah. Update panel.
Yeah, exactly. And then, jQuery, and then we kind of went on from there. So it'd be great if we could just kind of sprinkle this into our systems without having to just throw everything away and say, now we're doing this completely separate application for front end stuff.
Yeah. Well, the back end stuff with .NET is just, correct me if I'm wrong, your opinion is different, but it's just so fast and straightforward these days. I mean, if you were to say, okay, forget the UI, we're going to do the UI later, but everything that the UI is going to call, it just drops into place, right? It's no drama. No,
the most of my time is spent designing the features and talking with the business and figuring out what, you gave me some complicated thing, but you got to write this down about what you want to do. But when it comes down to code, it's like, okay, that's kind of that's the easy part.
Right.
Until you get to the front end. And now you have to worry about, we got these Angular widgets that have to talk to each other, and I have to create this API call. Now we can't drop in that widget because it's it doesn't play nice with this component or this dependency.
Well, if you pull the trigger on Blazor for the next project, we've got two Blazor apps in production now. They're both we haven't pulled the trigger on WASM, but the server side Blazor, the first one got to production in 15 business days from scratch, new Git repository, because literally it's one Visual Studio solution, and it was only I think 5 or 6 screens, so it wasn't terribly complicated, but it just fell into place. Every bit of it was C#, HTML and CSS, and it just literally was. Now, since then, the tuning and whatnot, and actually using Azure SignalR, that's key, because SignalR surprisingly is a lot of processing on a web instance.
Oh, yeah.
You want to offload that onto Azure SignalR. We did learn that, but Microsoft recommends that in the docs. We just didn't. It's like, oh, really?
Yeah.
Do we really have to? Oh, yeah, you really want to.
That is the one thing about consulting, though. I can't. I still use what my clients use. I don't often come into a project still these days where I'm like, okay, let me tell you what you're going to use on this project. It's more, I have to see what with that. So I'd love to, love to have that, opportunity beyond just me making yet another time entry app for me to solve my own problems.
There you go. All right. Well, this is a jam-packed episode. We could talk about the other open source projects that you've been involved with. But before we go, how can people find you?
Well, you can find me online on my blog at jimmybogard.com. And there I've got links to all the social stuff, videos. That's, of course, my blog as well. You can find me on Twitter at jbogard. And GitHub the same, github.com/jbogard. All my projects are there.
Awesome. Well, hey, thanks so much for coming on the show. It was a pleasure.
I appreciate it.
And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.